What's up, dear friends? Today I'd like to share with you a powerful and offbeat opening against the Sicilian Defense for white. The Sicilian Defense is one of the most common ways for black to react to your first move pawn e4, and the usual lines, the main lines after knight to f3, leads to very complicated lines with a ton of theory. That's why instead of that, I'd like to offer you an offbeat variation pawn to b4 known as a Wing Gambit. And at first, I was actually skeptical about this, I gotta confess, and I thought that with just a couple proper moves, black would easily get out of this with a solid advantage. But as I started playing blitzing against a couple of my friends who are playing this up to master and even grandmaster level, I realized that things are actually not that easy for black. There are a lot of difficulties, and so I wanted to elaborate more on this so that you can take advantage of this powerful and somewhat unknown opening weapon for white. Alright, so the first thing about this move pawn b4 is that we're deflecting black's pawn off the center. And as black accepts the pawn sacrifice, and 9 times out of 10 they will, you push the pawn to d4. And now before diving into variations, let me just share with you a couple of generalities about this position so that you know your plan, and even if you forget some specific lines, you still know how to proceed here, okay? So what do you got for this pawn that you sacrificed? First of all, clearly you've got these beautiful pawns in the center, and anytime you want, they're ready to be pushed forward and start attacking black, chasing black's knights away. For instance, as soon as black kicks the knight, forward, you can always kick it back. Also, another advantage here is that you can easily develop your pieces quickly because you have a lot of lines and diagonals. For black, for example, if they want to develop their bishop, they need to push the pawn first. If this pawn is pushed, now this bishop is kind of locked. And therefore, it takes time for black to figure out how to finalize development. But for you, it's very simple. You just bring all your pieces out very easily. And so, thanks to your quick development, you can start attacking earlier. And this idea of having a strong center, quicker development, and ability to attack early is are the white's main assets here in this position. Alright, what will black do here? Usually, in most cases, black tries challenging you in the center by playing pawn d5, because if not, you've got these beautiful pawns in the center, and black is concerned about that. After d5, indeed, black manages to undermine your center, but after this exchange, you can take advantage of black's exposed queen here by playing pawn to c4, and you gain an extra tempo, and you kind of rebuild your pawn center. Now, what can black do? If black just moves the queen backwards somewhere, then you end up with this space advantage and nice pawns again, and therefore, in most cases, black will take en passant. Now, you recapture by the knight, and you still win a tempo for your development. Now, queen needs to go somewhere. Where will it go? If it goes somewhere here, it's playable, but after bishop d2, black always has to be concerned about this potential discovered attack from your bishop. And for that reason, in most cases, instead, black goes queen to d8, because it feels safer. The queen is indeed much safer here. But now, you just keep playing forward and keep attacking. So the first move is bishop b5. Overall, you do want to attack here, of course, because you're a pawn down, and in order to claim your compensation, you need to be a little bit more aggressive than usual. But it's nice, right? Attacking is always nice. So bishop b5, bishop d7, and now rook b1. That's another side benefit of sacrificing the pawn. You have these nice files on the queen side for your rook, and your rook will typically go either to b1 or to c1 in the future. And in this position, along the b file, it already kind of x-rays this pawn on b7, and it's already somewhat unpleasant for black. If black ever captures here, actually you kind of develop your rook, and you start attacking here, and your rook is active, along these files, and it's pretty cool. That's why black usually doesn't do that, and black just tries to develop. Play e6 and simply develop. After that, you simply develop just as well, and after a couple developing moves, you break through in the center with the move pawn d5. It's again very common. As soon as you want to attack, usually you start pushing pawns in the center, breaking up black's pawns, and open up the lines for your attack. Now, what will black do? Well, let's say black captures here, you take on d5, black recaptures, now you recapture as well. And in this case, black already needs to be careful, because black's king is centralized, and as soon as you bring your rook to e1 and start attacking it here, black can be really in trouble, right? For that reason, black usually just castles here, trying to get away to safety, but now you can get your pawn back. After queen takes b7, you got your pawn back, you're also attacking this rook in the corner. The only move that saves black is bishop takes b5, which counterattacks your rook. So again, we recapture by the rook, still threatening this rook in the corner, and in most cases black will play the most natural move, which is nice for you because it's a losing mistake, it's the move knight to d7. And now after that, you just play rook d1, and because of this pin, the knight is lost. It can't go away because you'll grab the queen. Simple. And just to be completely clear, Stockfish said that on the previous move, instead of knight to d7, the move that saves black is queen to d7, which counterattacks this rook. And this move keeps black in the game, and white has some advantage, but it is not a winning position. But if you show this position to Magnus Carlsen and you tell him that, okay, white ends up with a slightly better endgame, then Carlsen will take a look at this and will be in the ecstasy of joy, because for Carlsen, having a slight advantage in an endgame is basically all he dreams about in life. And he'll most probably win this, even against any strongest player in the world. So a slight advantage in an endgame is not necessarily a draw. You can still play for a win. You can just play bishop e3, and even in an endgame, maybe you'll win this pawn and you'll promote eventually your pawn along the a file. So we've just analyzed the main line. That's how your games will go on most frequently when you use the Wing Gambit, and you can see that it's pretty difficult for black to get out. Even if they manage to escape from your direct attack, at least you can get your pawn back and end up with higher chances of winning. And there is also a nasty trap here in this line. I know you expected that, so why not? After black captures here, you play pawn d4. Another common move that black may play is simply developing their knight to c6. It looks decent, but it actually allows you to start attacking this knight right away. Pawn d5. Knight goes to e5, you keep chasing it with bishop to b2, this time attacking the knight once again, and after pawn d6, perhaps objectively better is playing pawn f4, kicking the knight away, but there is another move, knight to f3, which is almost equally good, but it also sets a really nice trap along the way. We're a new threat to this knight, and black needs to do something about that. If black simply captures here on f3, that's not a problem. You bring your queen out, and you still have advantage in activity, and everything's cool. The move that looks better for black is playing bishop g4, creating this pin and attacking this knight. It looks much more aggressive at first, but it fails due to a very powerful combination. Knight takes c5, and actually even master level opponents fall for these traps, so you have a chance to get a scalp of some advanced player here. Now, we're sacrificing the queen here, so bishop takes, but we're sacrificing it just for a second, because after bishop b5 check, there is no other way for black to cover the king but to give up the queen. And now you just start capturing everything and every move. It's almost like a give up chess for black. You start capturing here, then you capture on f7, check to the king, king takes d7, now you capture on d1, capturing the bishop, and on the next move you capture this rook, and you just literally destroy black's army completely, and you end up with definitely winning material advantage. Actually, in this position, the second most played move by black is pawn to e6, trying to play d5 in a way similar to the French defense. And then after, let's say you go knight f3, black goes pawn d5, and now capturing here doesn't make that much sense because black does not have to expose the queen. Black can recapture by the pawn instead, and for that reason you just play pawn e5 and you fix your space advantage here. And at first, if you take a look at this position, it looks like a French defense with an extra pawn for black. And looks like, it's just bad for white. But you know what? I played this position once by black, and I was not aware of this opening variation then. And so I thought initially that, yeah, it's a much better version of the French defense. I'm just almost winning. And you know what? I lost that game ultimately. And it turned out that it's much harder than it seems at first. Here white plays pawn a3, trading off this pawn on b4, because this pawn is a bit annoying, and this pawn a3 move is very common for these lines, so it's worth noticing. Because of this pawn, you can't bring your knight out, your pawn cannot move forward, so a3 is a very good move here. And after pawn takes, you don't recapture immediately, because this pawn cannot run away, and you keep the flexibility, because maybe you want to, at some point, take here with the bishop and trade off black's dark squared bishop, which is a defender of this, for example, weakness. Maybe your knight will land there in some distant future. Or you can capture by the knight, and from there the knight can possibly again be brought to this square d6. So you have different choices, and for that reason, for now, you just play pawn c3, you keep this beautiful pawn chain in the middle of the board, and you keep the flexibility of how you want to capture this pawn in the future. Now again, while black is a pawn up, theoretically, this extra pawn on a7 will be an asset in some eventual endgame, 30 moves later. But right now, this pawn doesn't help black at all. And black suffers for a couple reasons. First of all, it's pretty difficult to come up with any decent plan. And secondly, how can black develop the kingside pieces? If bishop comes here, then the knight can't go out. Right? So for that reason, maybe black will play knight to e7 first. Now you play bishop d3, knight comes to g6, and here there is another common attacking pattern. You play pawn h4, bring the pawn forward to h5. Now your rook actually comes into play along the h file, and again, pretty unclear what to do for black. If black ever plays pawn h5, that weakens black's kingside significantly. You know, the g5 square will always be for white's pieces. You know, anytime you want, you can capture here, disrupt black's pawn structure, so h5 doesn't look that good for black. Instead, in most cases, black plays bishop e7, still hoping to just somehow finish their development. They also think that it attacks the pawn. But now you play knight takes a3. From here, the knight is ready again potentially to go there, and if not, it can always just be brought to the game this way. And now, what can black do? Again, this h5 is really annoying. So for that reason, black says, okay, let me just grab this pawn now. But it fails, because after an exchange, you play queen to g4 with a double attack of this pawn and the bishop, together with the rook. And black can't hold on to both of them, so the bishop has to come back. But now queen takes g7 with a complete devastation here. After queen takes g7, black will have to play rook to f8. And now, frankly, we've got so many attacking options here. You're probably winning numerous different ways. Knight b5 is strong. Black plays a6 here, typically, which is quite funny because it does not really attack the knight because of this pin, right? So black can't take it, or else they would lose the rook, but they play it anyway because the knight is annoying. Now let's say you grab here with your rook on h7, bishop d7, black defends this rook, and now pawn takes b5 is a real threat. And although there are many ways for white to win here, I guess any decent move like knight d6 would still give you just a simple winning attack. Believe it or not, you've got checkmate in 5, right? It's queen takes f7, really beautiful. Rook takes, and then rook f8, h8 check, and we just start attacking the king right away. Now, what can black do? If rook comes there, there is bishop g6. Nice. Smothered checkmate by the bishop. And instead, if black covers it by the bishop, then knight to d6. We finally landed the knight here. As soon as you land the knight here, usually you have complete domination. And in this case, it's nearly a checkmate. King to e7, and now bishop g5. Again, virtually a checkmate. Black can delay for one more move, but that's still checkmate. It's really beautiful, and you can see that black is constantly under this pressure, and it's really difficult for black to figure out what to do, because wherever they go, there is always some danger. Some of your opponents will refuse to accept the pawn sacrifice because they're unaware of the theory of the following lines, and they'll just play pawn e6 saying, hey, I'm developing my pawn and I'm good to go. But it's actually not as smart as it looks at first, because after this exchange, you can win a tempo by playing pawn d4, and you're still having the space advantage, nice center. After bishop to b6, you can play pawn c3. Again, you're preparing to build up your nice pawn chain in the middle of the board, and we're also delaying development of this knight for a reason that I'm going to share in a moment. After, let's say, knight to a3, you can also delay this natural move one more time, and let's say play bishop a3, putting this bishop to a very active diagonal, and let's say knight c6, bishop d3. We're still waiting, and as soon as black castles here, here's the point: you can actually bring your queen out to the attack right away. And for that reason, we didn't want our knight to stand there earlier, even though knight f3 is a perfectly fine move. But if you delay it a little bit, you've got a chance to bring your queen out somewhere to h5 or sometimes to g4, and now you start attacking black right away, and it's quite unclear for black how to defend it. Now notice that this knight cannot move because it's pinned to the rook, so black can't move the knight, or else this rook will be gone. And then what? They gotta address this queen takes h7 threat somehow, right? So pawn g6, now queen h6, and black has a lot of these weaknesses, right? So your plan is very simple: knight f3, g5, and then queen takes h7. In this game, we're analyzing black played pawn f6, now knight f3. While it still has, as you can see here, strong pressure, maybe your h-pawn can move forward. Black traded here on e5, thinking that white will recapture, but white just played for the checkmate. Knight g5 and queen h7 is coming, and that is adios amigos. And of course, now let's address the most annoying question: how will Stockfish review this gambit? And if we're turning on Stockfish, Stockfish says that here clearly you gotta take the pawn. After pawn d4, Stockfish still wants to play pawn d5, following along the main line. And after pawn takes, here's the difference. While humans recapture by the queen because it's the most natural thing to do, Stockfish says you don't want to expose your queen too early. Instead, just bring your knight out, and then you can capture it by the knight. In this case, what do you do? Well, you still play pawn a3. Again, this is a common move, or else this pawn on b4 somewhat restricts you from moving this pawn or bringing your knight out. So we play pawn a3. And in this case, pretty much everyone takes here by the knight, because it also defends this pawn on b4, and it looks, just like the only move for black, really. Even though Stockfish recommends queen takes d5, but it doesn't change the situation too dramatically, and again, nobody plays it really. Everybody captures here by the knight. Then you trade here on b4, getting rid of this pawn. Now you can play pawn c3, kicking this knight off, and after knight d5, let's say you bring your knight out. Now black needs to be careful, because if black just plays something like knight c6, you can actually start pushing your pawns forward and kick all these knights back, so which may be annoying for black. So instead, black needs to be careful and play something like pawn a6. And in this case, yes indeed, on the following moves, both sides just develop, and we end up with a position where black is indeed a pawn up, and white does not have any immediate attack. And for that reason, you may call that it is kind of a refutation, but I wouldn't be so harsh on white here, because again, this extra pawn of black on the knight a7 will be an asset in some theoretical endgame which may occur or may not occur 30 moves later. But right now we're still in an opening stage or early middle game stage, and white has a lot of attacking opportunities here before black will potentially convert it to a winning endgame, right? So for example, you just play queen e2, black develops, and now you've got a choice. You can play more positionally, which is objectively speaking correct, play in the center like rook d1, centralize, play c4, kick this knight away, develop your own knight to c3, and thanks to your strong center and more space, open lines, you have some compensation for the sacrificed pawn. Or you can just go all out with your attack and instead just play queen e4, which is maybe objectively not as good, but in a real life game it'll probably work better. You simply want to capture this pawn and deliver a checkmate. If knight f6, you swing your queen over here. To the king side, again, we're pressuring this pawn. It's not a threat yet, it is defended by the knight, but anyway, it's annoying. Now, what does black do? Black can play g6 and blockade the diagonal for your bishop, but, having all these weaknesses definitely will give you some compensation. You can bring your bishop here out, and, it's still not that it's simple for black. If black ever tries pawn h6 instead, that would be a deadly mistake, because now just bishop takes h6, you destroy black's casting here, queen takes, and on the next move, knight g5, bishop h7, and it's gonna be a checkmate within a couple moves, most probably. So even though theoretically black is a pawn up, and if you're playing this against a grandmaster in an over the board game, probably black will win thanks to an extra pawn. But in a real life game, if your opponent is below 2000, and especially if it's a blitz game, it's much easier to attack with white rather than finding precise defensive moves with black. So I'd say that even with the Stockfish line of black, you still have a lot of compensation. And here's a little add-on. Some time ago I recorded a video about the so-called Portsmouth Gambit, where white plays the same move b4 on the next move. Not right now, but including the moves knight f3, knight c6, and pawn b4 right here. And I actually played it myself with a lot of success. It's really dangerous for black. So if you haven't watched that video, definitely may check this out right after watching this one, because clearly both variations are very similar and they will complement each other. So you can click over here and watch this video. Also, if you want to learn how to find those proper attacking moves yourself without relying on memorizing opening variations that I've shared with you, then you may attend my free masterclass by clicking the link over there. Either way, hope that you'll crush all the Sicilian players. Take care.